Hello and welcome to the NIH Library's bibliometric training series. My name is Chris Belter and I'll be one of the instructors for the course. I'm actually a bibliometric specialist here at the NIH Library. I've been doing bibliometrics for nearly 10 years now, and so I'll be one of the people taking you through the course series today. I want to start out with a little bit of background about why we're doing this training series in the first place. So as you're probably aware, bibliometrics are everywhere these days. Countries use bibliometrics for their own research assessment exercises. A number of countries do this. Universities use this for their own strategic planning purposes. There are a number of university rankings systems and ranking methods that use some component of bibliometrics in them. Down at the laboratory level, people use them both for hiring decisions, tenure decisions, individual level, tenure decisions, promotion, all kinds of things. So bibliometrics are becoming pervasive in the research assessment landscape. For good or for ill, they are becoming a major player, and so a lot of people are trying to become more aware about them and use them in additional ways to do these kinds of assessments. In that context, a number of librarians are beginning to provide bibliometric services to their patrons. We have to acknowledge that our colleagues in Europe particularly were sort of at the forefront of this movement. They've been doing bibliometrics for a good 10, 15 years now, and so that's already an established part of librarianship in Europe. It's also becoming more and more prominent in Asia, Australia, New Zealand. A number of libraries there are also doing this work. And then it's growing momentum here in North America. Particularly in the last year or two, we're seeing more and more bibliometric service programs pop up in university libraries across the country. We've heard from a lot of people and a lot of librarians that more people would be interested in doing this and more people would be providing these services if there was more training available for people to actually provide services. We hear over and over again that a lot of people were really interested in doing this kind of work, but they don't have the time to spend learning on their own. Their actual training resources are very, very scarce. There are a couple of week-long training sessions in Europe. There is an occasionally a 2 or 3 day training course here in North America, but really those are the only opportunities, and there are no recorded training sessions available for people who don't have the financial resources to be able to attend any of those trainings. So we know that there's a major opportunity here for additional training to be able to build capacity in doing bibliometric research. So that gap is really what the series is trying to address, is trying to provide a series of trainings to be able to provide bibliometric services either in libraries or outside libraries in order to make some of this training and some of this knowledge a little bit more available and more accessible to people around the country and around the world. So that's really what we're trying to get after in this series. So the real goal of this series is both to teach you how to do bibliometrics and why to do bibliometrics. We want to stress both of them. The course is really going to focus more on the how-to aspects, but in order to really understand how to do bibliometrics, you need to understand some about the context of why you're doing them, why you're doing bibliometrics in the first place, but then also why you're doing certain things that we're telling you. So why we have certain processes in place to do things, or why we're doing certain analysis procedures to get to certain goals. So we're going to focus mostly on the how-to, but we're also going to fill in some of that context to make you aware of why we're doing things, why things are necessary, those kinds of aspects. So it's a little bit of both. The instructors for this series are going to be myself, Chris Belter, Yaling Liu, my colleague who's been running the NIH Library Bibliometric Service program for as long as I have, and I would not be here without her, so kudos to her. And then our third instructor is going to be Candace Norton, who joined us about a year and a half ago as an NLM Associate Fellow, and who's now been brought on as a full-time employee of the NIH Library to help out with bibliometrics and a range of other things. So you'll be hearing from all of us over the course of this series. Yaling and I are going to be teaching the majority of the courses, and then Candace is going to teach a couple of additional courses. Some of the learning objectives for the entire series. The first thing we wanted you to be able to understand is understand what bibliometrics are, what their uses are, and what their limitations are. Bibliometrics are very, very powerful tools, and they can be used for a broad range of applications, but we also want to stress what the limitations of bibliometrics are, because there are some very, very serious limitations of the entire approach to using bibliometrics that we want to make you aware of and be able to understand when we're actually providing these services. Too often, bibliometrics are used without a full understanding of some of these limitations, so we want to at least introduce some of these limitations to you so you have an awareness of where bibliometrics fit in the larger landscape and what their limitations are. The primary learning objective, as I mentioned a couple of times, is to enable you to be able to perform a core set of bibliometric tasks and analyses. So what we're going to cover is essentially what we consider to be the core set of skills necessary for doing bibliometrics. Obviously, this is just our set of core skills, but this is what our goal is, to make you able to provide these services and to be able to perform these series of tasks and analyses on your own. And then finally, we also want you to understand a little bit about the context of how bibliometrics are being used, where they're being asked for, and who's asking for them. We found that it's really important to understand where your customers are coming from to be able to provide these services most effectively. And a lot of times they'll come to us with a somewhat incomplete understanding of what bibliometrics can actually do. So if you've got a better understanding of where they're coming from and what they're trying to do, it makes you much more able to provide services that are actually able to meet their actual information needs. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of the broader context of research evaluation, scholarly communication, those kinds of things, so that you've got a broader understanding of that sort of larger context in which these people are asking for bibliometric analyses. So those are really our major learning objectives for the whole series of courses. I want to also offer a number of disclaimers before we get started. There are a number of disclaimers for me to offer here, and they not only apply to my course, but all of the courses in this series. So all of the courses that I'm going to be talking about and any additional courses that we add to the website, I want to offer a couple of blanket disclaimers here that will apply to all of those. First, this is not the only way to do bibliometrics. This may not even be the best way to do bibliometrics. What we're going to teach you is our way of doing things. So I want to make it very clear that there are a number of other approaches, there are a number of different ways of doing things, there are a number of different applications of bibliometrics that we're not going to necessarily talk about today or in the course of this series. So again, I just want to stress that what we're going to cover today is the way we do things. It's not necessarily the best way, it's certainly not the only way, it's just the way that we happen to know, so it's the way that we're going to happen to teach you how to do things. I also want to say that this is the beginning of the learning process. This is by no means the end. I've been doing bibliometrics, as I mentioned, for over 10 years, and I'm still learning. I've been learning things this year. I've been doing additional capacity building. This is a constant learning process. You're never done with learning how to do bibliometrics. So again, our goal in this series is to teach you how to do a core set of bibliometrics that then you can use to learn how to do additional things depending on your own specific contexts and needs and situations. So again, even though we're going to teach a lot of things in this series, there's still a lot more to learn, and there's always a lot to learn. Third, more from the US government perspective, we're going to be talking about a lot of products and a lot of services and a lot of software tools in this course. These are simply the tools and resources that we happen to use. And any mention of these products during the course of this session does not actually constitute endorsement of any of these products or services by us, the NIH Library, the NIH, the US government, or anybody else. We just happen to use these. These are not endorsements of these particular products or tools. And finally, related to that, any opinions or positions that we happen to espouse in this series of training sessions are our own personal opinions. They do not necessarily represent those of the NIH, the NIH Library, the US government, or anybody else. These are our own personal opinions, and they should be taken as such. Okay, so with those disclaimers and things out of the way, let's actually talk about what we're actually going to do over the course of this series. The series is going to be a series of 13 courses initially, and these courses are going to be organized into 7 major themes. So those themes are going to be a series of introductory courses, and then a series of courses around getting data, cleaning data, running co-authorship or network analyses, doing topic analyses, doing citation impact analyses, and then finally a wrap-up session. So those are sort of the major thematic areas in which we're going to organize this whole series. We're doing it this way because this largely tracks with the order of operations in which you would do a particular analysis. So this is basically the order in which you would go in order to do any specific analysis that you happen to be asked to do. Not all analyses obviously do everything in all of these areas, but this is generally the order of operations that we tend to do things. Again, this is our order. It's not necessarily the only order, but that's the way that we tend to do things. So we thought it would be a good way to organize the series of training sessions that we're going to be talking about here over the course of this series. Getting into the actual courses that we're going to be talking about. So in our introductory series, this first one is going to just be about the series itself. But then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the analytical process itself, give you kind of an overview of what that looks like, and then give you a short introduction to the NIH Library's Bibliometric Services Program. Again, just the program here at the library. Next, in the second course, we're going to talk about give a general introduction to bibliometrics, what they are, what they're capable of doing, a little bit about the limitations, those kinds of aspects. The third course in the series is going to be a very high-level overview of the major resources and tools that are available for doing bibliometrics. So we're going to give you a very quick introduction to all of the resources that we know of and all of the tools that we know of for doing bibliometrics, and give you a little bit of an introduction to what they are, what they do, and how they work. The next series of trainings is about getting data, so we'll talk about working with Web of Science and Scopus in particular. Those are the major data sources that we use for the vast majority of our analyses. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to do searches, how to download records, how to use some of the tools that are built into these databases to do some initial analyses. We're then going to talk in the next course about some of the other data sources that we use. Particularly, we're going to be highlighting Insights, Federal Reporter, and PubMed. These are some other tools that we use on a regular basis for doing bibliometric analyses. So we're going to offer a brief introduction to those tools as well, with similar goals as the Web of Science and Scopus course. After we talk about that, the next part is about cleaning data. And so we'll do an overview of how to actually clean data or standardize variants of particular names in the original data using a tool called OpenRefine. We found that this is the most effective tool for doing this kind of work. So we'll talk a little bit about why this is necessary, and then also a hands-on introduction to how to actually use the tool to do some name cleaning of bibliometric data. We're then going to do a series of courses around network analysis. So we're going to start out by doing a series of courses around co-authorship analysis. So we'll introduce how to actually create co-authorship networks, either both at the individual level and also at the institutional level, using the Science of Science tool, or Sci2. We're then going to talk about how to visualize those networks using an open source software tool called Gephi. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with talking about how to actually sort of polish those network visualizations in a vector editing software called Inkscape. So how to clean up those visualizations, add legends, do other things like that in Inkscape to create a final visualization product. After that, we're going to talk about doing topic analysis of bibliometric data, focusing mostly on network methods of doing topic analysis. So we'll introduce word co-occurrence networks and then also bibliographic coupling networks to get a sense for what the research topics are in a particular set of publications. Again, there are a large number of other ways of doing topic analysis in bibliometrics, so this is, again, just an introduction to a couple of methods that are relatively easy to perform using the tools that we've already introduced. After that, we're going to talk about citation impact analyses. So we'll do an introduction to the entire idea of citation impact measurement, give you a sense of what some of the theoretical aspects of citation impact measurement are, talk a little bit about some of the basic indicators that are out there, and a little bit about the effect these indicators have on researchers' behavior. In the next course, we'll talk more in detail about some of the more advanced and alternative metrics. So we'll talk about field normalization, we'll talk about year source normalization, things like that. And then we'll also talk a little bit about alternative metrics, or alt metrics, in that course to give a little bit of an introduction to where the research is and what those things are all about, so forth, around alternative metrics. Finally, in our final course, we'll sort of try and sort of wrap everything up. We'll give you a sense of what a completed report looks like from our library. So we'll give you a sense for what our sort of standard template looks like, so you can see where all of these pieces fit into completed analysis. And we'll also talk quite a lot about the mistakes that Yaling and I have made in learning how to do bibliometrics along the way, what we've learned from them, and what you can learn from the mistakes that you will be making in learning how to do bibliometrics on your own. So that's what we're going to be doing over the course of this series. I want to also mention that in addition to the videos that we're going to be producing and making available on our website, we are going to have some additional resources to complement the videos for your additional learning. So we're going to have some additional reading, so original research articles, books, book chapters, things like that, that are going to be designed to accompany the courses that we're going to be teaching. So obviously we're just going to scratch the surface in these actual recordings. So we'll direct you to some additional reading that we found helpful in learning how to do bibliometrics. And those articles and book chapters are going to be arranged around the topics that we're going to be teaching in the course. So we're going to have reading for each week or for each of these additional courses as we move forward. That will be provided to you via email. And for those of you watching on the webinar, that will be a PDF document that will be posted alongside the recordings on our main training portal. We also provide a list of the data sources and tools that we're going to be talking about and that we use pretty frequently. We have that available on our bibliometric services page. So there's links out to where you can actually obtain all of these software tools, how to download them, some brief descriptions about what they are, what they do. So that's also available. And then finally, we're also going to make the actual PDF versions of any PowerPoint presentations we make available to you. We're also going to be creating transcripts of the recordings and making those available to you as well. So we're going to try and have as much as possible of additional resources for you to complement the videos as you're learning throughout this series. Finally, we're probably also going to be recording some additional courses over the course of the next couple of years. Again, we're going to just be scratching the surface in this initial set of trainings. So we will be doing some additional recordings, and we'll be posting those as supplementary courses to this larger set or this core set of analyses as we get around to them. No promises to when we're actually getting around to do that, but we do plan to do some of that training, and we do plan to make those things available as supplementary courses in addition to the ones that we've already outlined here. So that's all that I'm going to be talking about. That's at least an introduction to what we're going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and dive in. So in the initial video here, what we want to do is we want to introduce you to what the analytical process actually looks like. So from a project management perspective, when we get a request for an analysis, what is our process for actually turning around, filling that request, and delivering a final result? Once again, this is the analytical process that we do here at the NIH Library for bibliometrics. There are plenty of other processes, but again, we just want to give you an idea of what our process looks like when we're going through and providing services to customers. So a workflow of what that process looks like is here on the screen. So when we receive a request, that triggers the initiation phase, where we want to try and sit down with the patron to try and define the project in a little bit more detail. So I'll talk about each of these steps in more detail as we go along, but this is essentially the workflow. So we define the project first, then we, again, sort of scope out how we're actually going to go about gathering the data. We're going to gather it. Depending on whether or not it's necessary for the particular project that we're working on, we then need to clean the data in order to make that more representative and more accurate for an actual analysis. Then we're going to actually move into the analysis phase. And again, that's going to be dependent on that project definition that we established at the beginning of the project. We're then going to present the results, so we're going to reformat the data if necessary. If the patron is interested in actually getting the raw data, we'll reformat it into a way that's good for them. We'll create the visuals. We'll create whatever deliverable it is the patron is interested in, and then finally we'll deliver the results. So that's a very quick overview of what the project's process looks like. So let's delve into each one of these steps to talk a little bit more about what actually happens in these steps. So in defining the project, when we actually get an email request, they range in quite a lot in the amount of detail they're actually asking us for. Sometimes they ask us for the H-indexes of 2,000 people, or they might say, well, we want to evaluate our training program, or they want to say they want to evaluate the research that's come from a particular laboratory. So they can be very, very specific, or they can be very broad. It really depends on the actual customer. So at any point, the first thing that we always do is try and set up a meeting with the customer to establish what it is they're really asking for. This is just like a reference interview for those of you in the library world, where we really want to back the patron up beyond just what they're asking for to actually get at what the actual information need is. Most of the time, this is really important for bibliometrics, because most of the time people aren't necessarily as aware of what's possible in bibliometrics. So they ask for what they think is possible rather than necessarily what they're actually looking for. So we always take a lot of time at the beginning of any project to figure out what it is they actually want to know. So we always start at the end and work our way backwards. So we want to start with, what do you want to know, how do you want to use the results, and what do you want to learn as a result of this analysis? So we always start at the end and then establish what those needs are, and then work our way backwards into a methodology and a data source and an analysis process that would actually be appropriate for those questions. So again, we try and do this as a face-to-face meeting. Otherwise, we'll do it over email if that's not possible, or a WebEx meeting or a phone conversation, whatever it happens to be. We want to make it very clear what it is that they're asking us for and what they need, and then we'll establish an analysis from there. So once we've got the scope, then we'll determine the methodology to actually be able to meet those needs. And so at that point, we'll talk about what are the analyses that we need to do, what are the data sources that we need to draw from in order to do those analyses, and then which analyses we're going to do, those kinds of things. So again, it's really important to start at the end and then work our way backwards to establish the methodology for actually performing the analysis. And then, of course, it's always very important to establish what the timeline is. Some people will come to us and say, well, we want an analysis of everything we've ever funded by, I don't know, next week. That's not reasonable. So we need to establish what a reasonable timeline actually looks like, and then work out from there what is actually possible given that timeline. We're pretty fortunate here at the NIH where most of the people who are coming to us have pretty flexible timelines, but some don't. Some have very hard deadlines, and so we need to be aware of those deadlines before we start anything in order to sort of prioritize when we need to do certain analyses versus other things. So all of this is very, very important to do before you even start doing any kind of data analysis or data gathering, in order to know what it is you need up front so that you've got an idea of what is going to actually go into the project in order to then establish what would be an appropriate timeline for actually delivering that particular analysis. Once the project is defined, then we'll start moving into the data gathering phase. So in this, the first thing that we want to do is develop the search strategy that's going to be necessary for gathering the actual publication set. A lot of times in bibliometrics, and particularly in bibliometric research, a lot of people will kind of skip over this process or gloss over this process a little bit. But this is really important in doing bibliometrics, because the quality of the underlying data set directly affects whether or not the actual analyses have anything to do with reality. So it's very, very easy to use some of these data sources to generate a bunch of numbers, but if the search strategy is incorrect, and so if you don't have an accurate representation of the data set that you're trying to measure, the numbers that you get out of the data set are not going to have anything to do with actual reality. So it's very important to develop a search strategy that is going to give you at least a representative sample of whatever thing you're looking for is. This becomes especially important the smaller the analysis is. So the smaller the analysis, the more important this is, because the fewer publications you have, the more likely it is that that publication set is going to be affected by outliers. So when you're dealing with an individual or a laboratory, you essentially need to get everything by that individual or laboratory and nothing else. So it's very, very important to develop a search strategy that will actually accomplish both of those tasks. In library speak, you essentially have to have perfect recall and perfect precision in the same search. That's really, really difficult to do, so it's worth spending a lot of time up front developing the search strategy to make sure that the publication set that you're analyzing actually reflects what actually happened in whatever set of analyses that you're working on. Once the search strategy is complete, you would then run the search in whatever database you happen to be working in, and then downloading the results of that search strategy. In many cases, this is a somewhat trivial exercise because a lot of times you're dealing with a relatively small number of publications. But once you start zooming out to 5, 10, 20,000 publications, the data gathering phase becomes an issue because the limitations of the databases are such that you can either download 500 records at a time or 1,000 records at a time. So if you're trying to gather 20,000 publications, 500 at a time, that becomes a challenge in the amount of time it's going to take you to run a particular analysis. So we at the NIH Library have tried to automate this process as much as possible using code and APIs, but in a point-and-click type of an environment, it's something to be aware of, and it's something that becomes an issue the larger the data set becomes. Once you've actually got the data, and once you've actually gathered all of that in, it's then, depending on the goals of the analysis, you may need to clean that data. And what I mean by cleaning data is standardizing variant forms of the way names appear in some of these databases. So this idea of why are we actually cleaning this is because authors are endlessly creative in how they refer to themselves and their affiliations in published papers. I think Web of Science at one point estimated that there are well over 1,000 variants of the phrase National Institutes of Health that appear in the Web of Science database. And so if you're trying to do any analyses of those affiliations, you need to standardize all of those variants into a single variant that your computer software will then understand and actually come out with a final result for. Similarly with author names, if I publish as Belter C and also as Belter CW, any analysis tools that you're going to be using are going to treat those two variants as two different authors. So you need to standardize those variations before you actually go in to do any analysis in order to more accurately reflect reality. So it's a very labor-intensive process in most cases to do this kind of standardization, but it is absolutely necessary in order to get an accurate count of how many publications there are by a particular author, by a particular organization, or by a particular funding agency. So which of these sorts of names that you clean are going to depend on the goals of the analysis. So in some cases, we're not necessarily interested in counting the number of publications by individuals. We're more interested in looking at countries or institutions. So in that case, you want to know up front that you don't have to clean those author names to actually create a final analysis that meets the goals of your customers. So again, because this is a very labor-intensive process, you only want to clean the things that you absolutely have to clean. So you don't want to spend a lot of time cleaning institution names, for instance, if you're only going to be looking at publications per author. Or you don't want to spend a lot of time cleaning funding agency names if you're not actually going to be doing analyses by funding agency. So you really want to, again, spend time up front figuring out what the goals of the analysis are before you get into this data cleaning process, because in certain situations you may not necessarily need to clean as much data or any data, depending on what the goals of the analysis are, or you need to spend a lot of time cleaning data, and then that will affect the final timeline for delivering the actual results. Once you've got all of your data and you've got it cleaned up, then you can start running some analyses and actually analyzing the data that you have. Again, the analyses that you're actually going to run are going to be dependent on the scope of the analysis that you've defined at the beginning. So there are a series of analyses that one can run. One could spend years analyzing a particular data set. There are innumerable ways to slice and dice a particular publication set. So it's very, very important to figure out which analyses you are going to do and which ones you're not going to do in order to meet the needs of your actual customers. So again, it's going to be all dependent on what the scope of the analysis is. That will then define what analyses you actually run to create that final deliverable. We also find it helpful to talk about analyses in terms of themes. I'll come back to these in a little bit, but essentially the themes that we've come up with for talking about bibliometrics are themes of productivity, collaboration, research topics, and then impact, however defined. Impacts can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we tend to distinguish between things like citation impact versus clinical impact versus economic impact, other types of things like that. Those all require very different types of analyses and different data sources. So you again want to define what your customer means by impact before you go in, so you've got an idea of what you're doing. You can also not only run these analyses on their own, but also in combination with one another. So we might be interested in the effects of collaboration on impact, or the productivity of certain disciplines or research institutions in particular research topics, or other combinations thereof. So even though we're sort of talking about these sort of themes, we're interested in both the themes by themselves and then also in the intersections of these particular themes. Once you've got the actual analyses run, it's then time to actually turn those around into some kind of deliverable. And again, these are going to depend on the scope of the analysis, but most of the time we're focused on creating visuals of the final reports. We found through experience that people are far less interested in looking at long tables as they are in looking at charts, graphs, and visuals. They're much more interested in visualizations than they are in the raw data. So we spend a lot of time creating our visuals, cleaning those visuals, because most of the time, those are the things that people are actually going to look at. We'll also spend a lot of time creating some text for context. So writing up what the methodology was, writing up some notes and caveats about the charts and graphs that we actually put into the reports, things like that. We do spend a lot of time writing text. Unfortunately, our patrons often don't read that text, because very often they'll ask us questions that were directly answered in the text that we gave them, but at least we've got that text in there. That if people are responsible and actually read the full reports that we give them, those questions can be answered. We also write a number of texts to at least speak to the limitations of the bibliometric approaches and analyses that we're taking. So again, that we can recommend that people use or interpret our analyses in certain ways, and we recommend that our analysis be used in combination with other forms of evaluation, so that, again, we can sort of offer recommendations as to how to actually use the analyses that we give them. And finally, we'll combine all of that text and visuals into a single deliverable that we'll then deliver to our patrons. Most of the time, our patrons are interested in either a static report or some kind of PowerPoint presentation. Most of the time, those are the major deliverables that we'll give them. And actually, most of the time, we'll have just a set template report that we'll use sort of as a basis for combining this text and visual into a deliverable that we'll give to our customers. But again, what that deliverable is again going to depend on your customers. It's going to depend on the analysis. It's going to depend on that initial initiation and planning phase. So you do, again, need to spend some time up front figuring out what it is they want from you before you actually go ahead and deliver it. You'll save some time then back and forth later on saying that, oh, well, no, our patron actually wants this other thing and they want to add these other things to it, and it becomes a major sort of time suck in actually producing the final deliverable. So it's important to get an idea of what that looks like up front before you actually combine it into the final results. What we will also frequently do is, in addition to that final deliverable, we will usually set up a follow-up meeting to walk them through that deliverable, answer any additional questions they may have about that analysis, and do any kind of follow-up, so on. So most of our initial projects have both a meeting up front and a meeting at the end with the customer to define the scope at the beginning and then answer any questions about the deliverables that they may have at the end of the analysis, or working that analysis into any other sorts of products they might be interested in. And then again, as I said, there's a result delivery phase where we again present the deliverable and then schedule a follow-up meeting to walk them through that analysis. And then depending on what their interests are, we again might rework that deliverable into some other kind of presentation, maybe a published publication, other types of formats like that they may be interested in. So that's a very quick overview of what the analysis process looks like, a little bit about what to think about in each step of this along the way, and a little bit about how we do things here at the NIH Library. So I want to wrap this video up by talking a little bit about what the bibliometrics program looks like here at the NIH Library. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this for a long time, so I wanted to at least give you an introduction to what we do, how our service program is structured, and those kinds of things. So our bibliometrics program really started when our library leadership noticed an increasing demand for bibliometric services. So a number of the librarians and informationists here at the NIH Library had been providing bibliometric services for years at the NIH Library, but they've been doing it in a very ad hoc way. So they've been responding to requests as those people were asking for bibliometric analyses. So they would come to us, they would ask for us for something, and so we would do that as a part of the normal reference services that we would provide to our patrons. Starting around 2013, 2014, the library leadership noticed an increasing demand for bibliometric services. They had also just established additional custom service areas at the library. So they had developed a very successful bioinformatics program in previous years. They had just launched the data services program at that time, which then also became very popular. So they thought maybe they wanted to build on some of these other successful specialty service areas to create a bibliometrics specialty service area. So in the beginning of 2014, they had two general informationist or reference librarian positions open. They repurposed both of those positions into bibliometric specialists. So they hired two bibliometric specialists to fill that position to essentially create the library's bibliometric services program. Those two specialists happened to be Yaling and myself. So we were brought on in May of 2014 to essentially invent the NIH Library's bibliometric services program. So we then took a little bit of time, figured out what the service program was going to look like, wrote up a little bit of a charter, and then formally launched the actual service in June of 2014. And so we've been going since then to providing services to NIH customers. The kinds of services that we provide can be roughly organized into four major themes. The first theme of services that we provide are consultations. So these can be as quick as answering an email about a particular bibliometric metric, or it could be involved as setting up a consultation to walk through and set up an actual analysis. So essentially we answer questions, we provide expertise, and we provide guidance on both what bibliometrics are, but also how to use them and how to design bibliometric analyses that people can run on their own. The second major thematic area of the services that we provide is around training. So we actually have quite a lot of people here on staff at NIH who are program analysts who want to analyze the publications that have resulted from their own grant portfolios. So we have managers of research grants around a particular theme, and one of the things that they do as part of their management activities is analyze the results of the grant funding that they manage. So we have people who are interested in running their own analyses of their own publication sets. So we offer training, again, related both to the theoretical aspects of bibliometrics as well as the hands-on aspects of actually conducting these analyses. We try to do a couple of courses every quarter in sort of offering these kinds of trainings, and we try and balance between the theoretical aspects and then the actual hands-on analyses. We also run a number of analyses that we refer to as core analyses. These are analyses that we do without anybody asking us to do them. So these are analyses that we do of our own volition to analyze our own research output here at NIH. So not a lot of people know this, but the National Institutes of Health is actually one of the largest producers of research in the world. In addition to being a large funder of biomedical research, we also have a very large research staff who do conduct their own original research. So a lot of our core analyses are focused on analyzing that intramural research effort. So we'll analyze publications either at the departmental level, at the institute or center level, and then across all of NIH to both inform NIH leadership about the intramural research efforts that are happening, but also to inform our own staff and our own library about the research that's happening so that we're better positioned to provide services that align with the interests of our own researchers. We will also run a series of analyses of the grant funding for our intramural research staff. So our own researchers actually apply for intramural research funding in order to perform their own analyses. So we'll not only analyze the publications that they produce, but also the grants that they propose in order to get a more well-rounded look at the kinds of research that they're actually doing here at NIH. The vast majority of the time that we spend, though, is spent running our custom analyses. So the custom analyses are analyses that we run for NIH staff on request. So these are very, very custom to the needs and expectations and situations of our own research staff. And these run the gamut from analyzing portfolios of grant funding to looking at the outputs of our research funding, either at the portfolio level or at the institutional level. And then we'll also do what we refer to as landscape analyses. And these landscape analyses are really analyses of all research on a particular topic. So we'll look at all research on Alzheimer's disease or cancer rehabilitation or autism or whatever the research topic might be to get a sense for what's going on around the world in this particular research discipline to inform our own strategic planning. So we always have a number of strategic planning efforts where we survey the literature and look for gaps in the research or emerging research areas that we might want to encourage in the future for future funding announcements. So using bibliometrics, we can then use these kinds of analyses as tools for informing that strategic planning effort to then allocate resources in a more informed way. Again, as we mentioned, we do a number of thematic analyses related to bibliometrics. So again, we're interested in themes of productivity, collaboration, research topics, and citation impact. So in productivity, what we're really interested in is analyzing how much research there is given something. So we're interested in how many publications there are, per year, per journal, per person, per institution, per whatever in particular time periods as a measure of how much research is happening in any one of these given areas. In collaboration, we're interested in to what degree are people co-authoring publications to produce original research. So are they collaborating at the individual level with people within their institute or center? Are they collaborating with people at other areas or other branches of our own institution? Are we collaborating with people in universities, or are we collaborating with industry, with people in other countries? All of these other kinds of methods of doing collaboration, we're interested in sort of measuring to what degree they are doing that, and also to some degree to which they're not collaborating, because in some ways that isn't as informative as what they are actually doing. In terms of the research topics, we're interested in looking at, within a sort of umbrella of research, what are the major thematic areas or research directions that are represented in that particular data set. So if we're looking at publications by one of our institutes, we're interested in what are they working on related to whatever disease area they happen to be interested in. So if we're looking at publications from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, obviously they're interested in cardiovascular and hematological diseases. But what aspects within that sort of larger umbrella are they really interested in? Are they more interested in the genetic components? Are they more interested in sort of clinical trials and treatment of diseases? Are they interested in the epidemiology of these diseases? Those kinds of questions. So given these very, very large data sets, what are they interested in, and what is the research that's happening within this, not only as a whole, but also over time? How are those topic areas changing over time? Are those research interests shifting, maybe with shifts that are going on outside the institute, or as a result of initiatives that are being launched within the initiative or within the institute? And as an even more basic question, are those research interests aligned with what the strategic plan is for that particular institute? In some cases they are aligned, in some cases they're not. And so both of those things are very interesting to the kinds of people that we're working with. Finally, we're also very interested in citation impact. So we're interested in looking at how useful or influential papers are for writing other papers. So we talk about that in terms of citation impact as impact on future scientific research. Again, we're very careful to distinguish citation impact from other kinds of impact to make it clear what it is that we're actually talking about here. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we actually get to those particular sessions, but again, those are the kinds of questions that we're interested in that particular theme. We also have a number of service policies that we've instituted at our particular library, essentially in order to protect our time. There are only 2 and now 3 of us to actually provide bibliometric services for the entire National Institutes of Health. And so in order to ensure that our services and our time was equitably distributed among the institutes and centers here at NIH, we instituted a number of policies in order to protect that time. Because one of the things to be very careful about in bibliometrics is not allowing one project to take all year, because it can. You can spend years working on only a single analysis. So we wanted to have some mechanism of saying we're not going to do this, or some mechanism of saying we're going to stop working on this analysis at some point. To be honest, we don't like talking about these very much because most of the time they don't come up with our customers, but I did at least want to mention them as maybe guides that maybe other people or other libraries might be interested in adopting for their own use. So we have essentially 2 tiers of services within the library's bibliometrics program. So we have our free services, and then we have fee-based services. So we use that fee-based service as a way to protect our time while still making some of those services available for people who want us to spend a lot of time working on a particular analysis. So within our free services, we have a minimum of a 2-week turnaround time. So we will not do an analysis if the deadline for that analysis is less than 2 weeks. If somebody wants an analysis in less than 2 weeks, they need to pay us for the time that we're going to spend delivering that analysis and not working on other analyses. We also have a maximum policy of we're going to spend up to 40 hours of work on any one given project. If we spend more than 40 hours on a project, then it transitions into a fee-based service. We set that 40-hour limit relatively high in order to make sure that the vast majority of the analyses that we receive, we can do. So the vast majority of the projects that we get asked to do can be completed within this 40-hour time period. So we don't even mention it in most cases unless we start to get to that point or unless we think the project is going to be that long. So at that initial planning phase, we can get an estimate of how long we think it's going to take to do the particular set of methodologies and analyses that we agree on. And if we think it's going to be more than that 40 hours, then we'll mention this policy. But if we think it's going to be less than that 40 hours, we'll just go ahead and do it, we won't even mention it. If there's a project that sort of starts to bleed into that 40-hour limit, we'll alert the customer as soon as we start getting close. So if I start spending maybe 25 hours on a project, and I think it's going to take more than another 15 hours or so to complete the project, I'm going to let the customer know. I'm going to say, look, we've got this policy. I'm going to need to stop working at some point so that we can then sort of come to an agreement of, okay, what am I going to do? What am I not going to do? How are we going to change the project to either get it to within that 40-hour time period, or they're going to have time to transition into a fee-based service. And then the final thing that we sort of have a very, very loose policy around is the number of analyses per customer per year. Some of our customers are very, very happy with our results, and so they ask us for 10 more things. So we'll do a project for them, they think this is fantastic, and they'll ask for 10 more. We have to have some kind of a mechanism to say we're going to only do so many of those because we need to also spend time working with other people. So we have a very, very loose rule of somewhere in the 3 to 5 analyses. We're sort of squishy about this. But we have to have some mechanism to say we're not going to do all 10 this year. We're going to have you prioritize which ones we're actually going to do. So again, these are our policies, and I will be the first to admit that we're not as strict in enforcing them as maybe we should be. But these are at least analyses or policies that we have to fall back on in case we run into some of those situations where they're asking us for lots of research that's going to take far more of our time than would be equitable. So that's kind of our free service model. Our fee-based service model is essentially any exception to those policies. So we can make exceptions to any one of those policies or all of those policies if the customer is willing to reimburse the library for the additional time that we spend working on that particular project. So if they want us to do 10 analyses in a year, sure, we can do that if you pay us for the time it's going to take to do the other 5 or 6 analyses that are above and beyond what would be normal. Or if they want a 1-week turnaround time, because we actually have customers who need projects turned around in 1 week. They can then pay us in order to have us prioritize those projects and essentially drop everything else in order to accommodate that 1-week turnaround time. So essentially any exception to any one of these policies are possible if they are willing to reimburse the library for the time it takes for us to do this analysis. So that's essentially the model that we've come up with to essentially protect our time to ensure that we're not spending too much time on any one project or too much time for any one particular customer. So we, again, use those fees in order to say, yes, they're possible, but only if you're really interested in having us actually spend this time. So in terms of the actual services that we actually provide per year, you can see here that we provide a lot of services per year. We average somewhere between 15 and 18 requests per month, which translates to somewhere around 200 requests per year. In terms of the total numbers, you can see it's relatively evenly split between consultations and analyses, but our consultations and tutorials typically take a lot less time than the actual analyses. So the vast majority of the time we actually spend are on those analyses, even though we do answer a number of additional requests. You can also see that we grew pretty substantially over the first 3 years in which we were here. So there was obviously a pretty substantial need for bibliometric services here at NIH. We have, in fact, become so popular that we don't even advertise our services anymore. All of our projects come in either through word of mouth or they're repeat customers. So again, there was quite a substantial need for bibliometric services, and the service program in itself has been very, very well received here at NIH. So that was about all that I wanted to cover in this initial session. Once again, we'll be delving into all of these topics in a little more detail as we work through the initial training sessions. Next up, we'll dive into Bibliometrics 101 and really get into a lot of detail into what bibliometrics are, how they're used, and what those resources are that are available for actually doing bibliometrics.